On the morning of September 14, 1851, the quiet streets of a small Georgian town were pierced by an unnatural stillness. At the Hateville cotton press facility, the air hung thick with the residue of last night's toil, sweat, grease, and the scent of raw cotton pressed too tightly to breathe. There, beneath the massive iron press, lay Tobias Stroud, the overseer whose reputation for cruelty had cast a shadow over every worker for more than a decade. His skull had been obliterated, compressed to an unrecognizable pulp by the very machinery he had mastered, the press wheel having turned 17 times, each rotation delivering an unbearable weight. The press itself had not faltered. The mechanics, precise and cold, obeyed only the law of force, not mercy. What made this scene more horrific than the sheer violence wasn't just the body, or the absence of it, but the evidence left behind. A small wooden stool sat nearby, simple, unadorned, its scuffed surface betraying repeated use. Whoever had used it was no taller than 4 feet, and the implication was unavoidable: a child had operated the cotton press. But this was no ordinary child. Records later recovered, buried deep in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, revealed a boy purchased not for labor, not for promise, but for a mere 8 cents, the price of a broken tool. His name, scarcely more than a footnote, was Small Thomas. The documents make no mention of his crime, and the official history has been silent ever since. Small Thomas had arrived at the cotton facility as a curiosity, a blemish, a thing to be exploited. Stroud had acquired him not for compassion but for control. The boy's dwarfism, his twisted limbs, his crooked spine, all were seen as assets, as tools to reach into spaces too tight for men, to fetch what adults could not. But there was something else hidden in the overseer's intent, a darker impulse, a need to shape, to command, to extract obedience from what was broken. And for Thomas, it was survival that demanded more than obedience. It demanded calculation, patience, and a silence that masked an intelligence the adults around him did not yet comprehend. This is the story of what happened in those shadows, of a child who became an instrument of lethal precision, and of a truth that generations have tried to bury. As you listen, you are stepping into a place few have dared to see. If you are ready to witness the hidden mechanisms of power, of corruption, of quiet vengeance, subscribe to this channel. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from. What town, what state, what world outside these walls, because the story that follows will reach into your understanding of history, of human cruelty, and of survival itself. And if you feel it, type it twice in the comments to seal it within you. I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth. Repeat it. Let it anchor you. The story of Small Thomas did not begin with violence, but with commerce, a marketplace that treated human life as a ledger entry, a fraction of a dollar, a commodity to be traded and discarded. Hateville in 1851 was little more than a crossroads of exploitation. 23 buildings, 2 churches, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and the rest were homes for the wealthy who rarely stayed in town, coming only for business, for profit, for the rituals of power. And at its center, as though the town itself had grown around it, stood the cotton press facility, a sprawling structure of iron and timber, machines groaning under the weight of raw cotton, preparing it for distant mills that would never know the names of those who labored to feed them. Cyrus Geintree, the facility's owner, was a man whose fortune had come from calculation rather than cultivation. Cotton passed through his presses like a river, and he took his toll from every bale, every ounce pressed, every bead of sweat extracted from the enslaved workers under his control. Gantry was 30, married, father to 3 daughters, a man who fancied himself reasonable, efficient, and humane, but in the quiet spaces between his ledgers and his dealings, he measured human value in numbers. Yet it was Tobias Stroud who maintained the pulse of the operation, a man feared more than the owner himself. 41 years old, cruel, precise, obsessed with productivity, he ruled the facility like a general commanding a garrison of ghosts. Into this machinery of domination Small Thomas arrived, bought for 8 cents, almost discarded, a boy whose deformities made him appear less than human in the eyes of the onlookers. Yet Stroud saw opportunity in his diminutive form, envisioning him as both tool and possession, a creature molded to serve the relentless rhythm of the cotton press. Thomas's limbs, his uneven gait, his fragile frame, They were obstacles to some, instruments to Stroud. He was assigned the darkest corners, the smallest spaces, the places where the press's teeth would snatch at any adult who dared enter. And Thomas learned. He observed. He adapted. Each task, each crawl beneath the iron plates, each brush against lethal machinery became a lesson in patience, calculation, and silent observation. The other enslaved workers, seeing his condition, extended what little kindness they could. Bess, who cooked for the laborers, slipped him extra rations. Prophet, an old man who tended the presses, taught him the secrets of the machines, the subtle movements, the danger zones, the moments when the iron was merciful. But Stroud watched every motion, every glance. Every quiet thought was catalogued in the boy's mind, even as the overseer believed he was shaping obedience. What Stroud did not understand, and would never suspect until it was too late, was that Thomas was not merely surviving. He was learning to wield the machinery itself, to understand its pulse, its weight, its lethal potential. The summer sun rose higher, the harvest season pressed on, and small Thomas grew invisible in plain sight, a shadow moving through iron cotton, calculating each turn of the wheel, each press of the lever. And with every observation, a plan began to form. Not in rebellion, not in childish fantasy, but in the cold, precise awareness of someone who understood the power lying just inches from his small hands. By mid-August, the facility had transformed into a furnace of relentless labor. The presses thundered day and night, cotton bales stacking like monuments to human endurance and suffering. Small Thomas moved through it all with a rhythm that seemed almost unnatural. His body twisted and uneven, yet each motion deliberate, precise, almost imperceptible to the overseer who believed him merely a fragile tool. Stroud took pride in the boy's adaptability, praising him quietly in front of others while maintaining the cruel rituals that reminded Thomas of his worth, 8 cents. The sign hung around his neck like a scarlet letter, branding him, marking him as property as lesser. Yet, in the shadows of those lantern-lit halls, Thomas's mind worked in ways Stroud could not fathom. It was during these long nights, when the rhythmic clatter of the presses became a hypnotic drum, that Thomas began to understand the machinery's pulse. He watched how the iron plates descended slowly, how the screw mechanism engaged, how the tension built with each turn of the wheel. He observed Stroud's habits, his patterns, his predictability. The overseer believed his control absolute, yet Thomas saw the cracks in it. Every glance away, every moment of inattentiveness, every assumption that a child could not wield comprehension. And Thomas began to imagine the power contained within those mechanisms, the lethal force that could be redirected. The thought was not born of malice at first. It was born of calculation, of understanding that survival required awareness, that knowledge could become protection. Prophet noticed something subtle in the boy, an intensity in his eyes that was no longer blank, a focus that hinted at comprehension beyond his size. "Child," the old man whispered one evening, leaning close so no one else could hear, "you watch too long. Don't let them see it in your eyes." Thomas nodded, the shadow of a smile hidden beneath the stoicism Stroud had forced upon him. The boy's silence was not weakness, it was patience, observation, preparation. Every detail of the press, every timing of the wheels, every groove in the wood and iron became part of a mental map that no adult had taught him. And as August faded into early September, the rhythm of the harvest reached its peak. Wagon after wagon arrived with cotton, presses ran continuously, and workers stumbled through exhaustion. Thomas had become indispensable, yet still underestimated, still a curiosity to Stroud, still bound by the sign that marked him 8 cents. But in the quiet moments, alone with the iron and wood, the boy began to imagine the impossible. The thought whispered to him in the shadows, a question with a weight heavier than any bale of cotton. What if the very thing that controlled him could be turned against its master? The nights in Hateville were long, stretching hours into an indistinguishable blur of heat, cotton dust, and the relentless grind of iron. Small Thomas, small enough to move unseen through narrow spaces, began to spend more time near the main press than any overseer would have permitted. He studied its gears as though reading a book, memorizing every notch, every turn of the screw, every subtle sound that signaled movement or pressure. No adult suspected how deeply he understood it. Stroud believed he was merely training the boy, extracting labor from a body society had deemed defective. But in those small, silent moments, Thomas's mind became a repository of forbidden knowledge. The rhythm, the timing, the exact rotations needed to crush and compress, knowledge that would later shatter the illusion of power itself. The other workers noticed changes. His movements were faster, more deliberate. His eyes no longer darted with fear or confusion but scanned, calculated and absorbed. Prophet had tried to warn him once, leaning close beneath the flickering oil lamps. "Child, you are learning too much. Knowledge is a weapon. It grows inside you like poison if you don't control it." Thomas had only nodded, his expression unreadable, the blankness Stroud demanded perfectly restored. Yet behind that mask a new awareness had begun to form, an understanding that the machine, the very symbol of Stroud's domination, was predictable, obedient, and if approached with care, entirely controllable. And there, in the shadows of Hateville, the boy's mind turned inward, measuring the limits of his own body against the limits of the press. Step by step, crawl by crawl, he mapped every inch of space beneath the iron plates, memorized the weight of the mechanism, the pressure at each rotation, the exact moment when metal resisted or yielded. It was a lesson in patience, in observation, in waiting for opportunity. Stroud remained unaware, oblivious to the mental architecture Thomas was constructing. A blueprint for inevitability. As the harvest reached its crescendo, the tension inside the facility became almost tangible. The press roared like a living creature, men and women moved like shadows, the sweat and dust coating everything in a haze that made hours disappear. And within it all, Thomas moved silently, a ghost beneath and between the gears, a student of destruction, a child whose existence had been reduced to 8 cents, yet whose mind now grasped forces adults could not even comprehend. And now, if you are following this story, repeat twice in the comments, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let it anchor you, for what comes next cannot be unseen. Subscribe, and tell me where you are listening from, your town, your state. Because this story is not just of a boy, a press, or a man crushed. It is of power, knowledge, and the calculated patience that bends fate itself. By early September, the cotton harvest had transformed Hateville into a hive of relentless motion. The presses groaned with every turn, wagon after wagon disgorged raw cotton, and the workers moved like automatons, their bodies exhausted, their minds numbed by routine. Small Thomas, however, moved with a purpose that no one could see. Each step, each crawl beneath the iron press was deliberate. Every rotation of the wheels he observed, every lever, every gear. He committed to memory, constructing a mental map that no adult could anticipate. The boy who had once been dismissed as worthless for 8 cents had become an invisible presence of observation, a silent scholar of destruction. Stroud continued to believe he was molding obedience, controlling every action with a mix of hunger, punishment, and ritual. The wooden sign hung around Thomas's neck, declaring his value to the world, yet concealing the truth from everyone else. 8 cents. Stroud would mutter when anyone asked about the boy, a casual dismissal that masked the meticulous training in patience and precision he believed he was imposing. But Thomas's training was his own. Every night, after the workers had left, he lingered near the press, crawling beneath the iron plates, testing the range of motion, feeling the weight, imagining the perfect pressure, the exact number of turns required to achieve absolute force. Prophet had warned him, quietly, in the dialect that could slip past others' ears. "Child, knowledge is fire. Too much and it will burn you, too little and it will burn them." Thomas had nodded once, expression neutral, and returned to his observations. He had begun to see patterns in the overseer's routine, in the timing of meals, in the lapses of attention, the tiny windows of vulnerability that Stroud never imagined existed. The boy's mind was no longer just absorbing, it was calculating. Each observation was a step in preparation, each breath a rehearsal, each glance a measurement. And now, as the shadows lengthened and the last lamps flickered on, small Thomas began to understand a terrifying truth: the press, a tool of oppression, could be wielded in reverse. The knowledge he had collected, the rotations, the pressure, the leverage, the timing, was enough to turn the instrument of his servitude into an instrument of retribution. If you are following this story, take a moment now. Subscribe and comment your location, your town, your state. Let it anchor your presence here in this space of forbidden knowledge. And twice in the comments, whisper to yourself, I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth. This is no longer a story of labor or cruelty. This is the story of observation becoming power, patience becoming inevitability, and a child, dismissed and broken, preparing to rewrite the rules of fate. The days following early September passed with the rhythm of inevitability. Small Thomas moved through the cotton facility like a shadow, unnoticed but fully present, each motion carefully measured, each observation added to the growing architecture of his understanding. Stroud remained confident in his dominance, his every step through the facility a demonstration of power, his whip coiled at his belt, his eyes constantly scanning for disobedience. But what Stroud did not see was the silent awareness building in the boy he had purchased for 8 cents. Every iron plate, every chain, every crank, every lever was catalogued in Thomas's mind, each piece of machinery a lesson in precision, patience, and lethal possibility. The boy began to notice the subtle patterns of the overseer's behavior, the times when he became distracted, the points where his focus waned, the exact moments when he assumed control without verifying it. Thomas saw that Stroud, despite his cruelty and vigilance, was predictable, and in that predictability lay opportunity. Small Thomas began testing his own limits cautiously, learning exactly how much pressure could be applied, how quickly the wheel could turn, how far the iron plates could descend without triggering failure. Each test was small, almost imperceptible, designed to avoid detection while adding to the reservoir of knowledge that would soon become his most powerful weapon. The other workers, who had grown accustomed to his presence, began to notice a change. His movements were smoother, more deliberate, almost hypnotic in their efficiency. Prophet watched from a distance, understanding that the boy's intelligence was growing into something Stroud would never anticipate. He learns too fast. The old man murmured to Bess one night, his voice tight with unease. There is a fire in that child, a fire no one owns. And in those quiet hours, Thomas began imagining the unthinkable. The press, a tool of fear and oppression, could be transformed into a force that even Stroud could not resist. The mental map of the machinery, combined with his knowledge of the overseer's routines, became a plan, precise and terrifying in its clarity. Every observation, every careful measurement, every small act of survival coalesced into a single unshakable certainty. The boy who had been dismissed as worthless was now poised to seize control of his own destiny, and the consequences for Stroud would be absolute. For those listening, this is the point where observation turns into inevitability. Subscribe and comment your location to mark yourself as witness, and twice, in the comments, whisper silently to yourself, I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth. This is no longer a story of survival alone. This is the prelude to a reckoning. By mid-September, the cotton facility had become a world defined by routine, but small Thomas no longer participated as a mere cog in the machine. Every action, every movement, every crawl beneath the press was deliberate, a rehearsal for what he now knew was possible. Stroud, confident in his authority, continued his rounds with the same arrogance, never considering that the smallest figure in the room had studied him more intensely than any adult ever could. The boy's eyes, once blank and unreadable, now held a subtle intensity, a calculation, a patience, a cold awareness that the overseer could not detect, but that would one day turn inevitability into action. Thomas began testing the first boundaries of his plan with meticulous caution. He would nudge a gear here, lift a lever there, observing how the machine responded. Each small test was a calculation in physics, in leverage, in force, the combination of human knowledge and mechanical precision. He memorized every nuance. The way the iron plates creaked under strain, the exact timing of the screw mechanism, the amount of pressure needed to compress cotton into a dense bale. What others saw as a child laboring under oppression was, in reality, a mind crafting a blueprint of destruction. The workers around him, while sympathetic in their own ways, remained oblivious to the danger building silently beneath the surface. Bess continued to slip him extra food, seeing only a fragile child struggling to survive. Prophet, however, watched with a mixture of fear and awe, sensing the intelligence at work. That boy, he sees what we cannot. There is a shadow growing inside him, the old man whispered one evening, The words carried on a breath of cotton dust. The shadow, he could not know, was not darkness for darkness's sake. It was precision. It was inevitability. Stroud, proud of his small acquisition, continued to force the boy into obedience, reminding him daily of his value 8 cents. The sign remained a constant humiliation, but Thomas had long since learned to cloak his thoughts. He had learned to appear smaller than he was in intellect, more compliant than he felt. Every command from Stroud, every careless oversight became data, a calculation that would inform the ultimate act. And now, as the lanterns flickered across the press room in the hours before dawn, Thomas began to understand something terrifyingly precise. He did not need to hurry. He did not need to act rashly. The moment would come when patience, preparation, and knowledge would align perfectly. And when it did, the very instrument that had enforced his subjugation would become the agent of retribution. For those listening, remember this. Subscribe and comment your location to anchor yourself in this forbidden history. And twice, whisper silently in the comments. I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth. You are now a witness to the calculated patience of inevitability. The nights in Hateville had grown heavier, thick with the scent of cotton, oil, and sweat. Small Thomas moved like a shadow, almost imperceptible beneath the lantern-lit press, his mind calculating with an intensity no adult suspected. Each turn of the wheel, each inch of the iron plate's descent, each subtle shift of the chains became a measure of possibility. Stroud, arrogant in his power, had never considered that a boy purchased for 8 cents could comprehend the full capacity of the machinery he commanded. And yet, Thomas had studied it all, not just to survive, but to understand how to reverse the hierarchy of control. This section of the facility, normally a place of dull, endless labor, had become his classroom. Crawling beneath the press, he tested each lever, each crank, feeling the weight, memorizing the subtle vibrations, calculating the exact rotations that would achieve total compression. Every movement was measured, deliberate, controlled. The other workers, exhausted by the endless grind, barely noticed him, assuming he was simply a fragile child doing his assigned tasks. But Thomas's observations were turning into experiments. Each small test, seemingly inconsequential, taught him the limits of the iron, the mechanics, and the psychology of the man who believed he had absolute control. Prophet had warned him once, his voice low and almost fearful. Child, the knowledge you carry is dangerous, but it is yours. Guard it. Use it wisely. The moment comes, you must be ready. Thomas nodded, his expression blank, hiding the storm of understanding inside. Every day, Stroud's arrogance gave him new data, his patterns, his routines, the times he was distracted, the moments he assumed obedience as default. The boy's mental blueprint of power was nearly complete, each component of the press mapped in his mind, every step rehearsed, every possible contingency considered. And here, for anyone following closely, we reach a moment of ritual acknowledgement. Twice in the comments, whisper to yourself, I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth. Let it settle. Let it mark your awareness, because what Thomas was preparing would defy comprehension, a precise act of retribution calculated down to the smallest fraction of iron and force. Subscribe and comment your location. Let your presence anchor this forbidden knowledge. By now, the boy had moved from mere observation to subtle manipulation. Small adjustments here, minute changes there, testing without alerting Stroud, gauging responses, assessing leverage, calculating the inevitable moment. The stage was set. The machinery, the overseer, and the child, everything aligned in a quiet symphony of preparation. The first act, almost imperceptible, had begun. As September deepened, the rhythm of Hateville's cotton facility became almost hypnotic. Wagon after wagon of cotton arrived, the presses thundered without pause, and workers moved in exhausted patterns, their bodies operating on muscle memory while their minds drifted in fatigue. Small Thomas, however, existed in a different dimension of awareness. Every sound, every vibration, every creak of iron was a word in a language he alone could read. Stroud, consumed by his sense of dominance, could not comprehend the depth of the child's understanding. To him, Thomas was still a fragile curiosity, a tool whose value measured 8 cents. But the boy had become a master of observation, a silent architect of inevitability, and each day brought him closer to the moment he had calculated in his mind. The subtle manipulations began to escalate. Thomas would adjust a gear slightly, nudge a lever ever so carefully, observe the resulting motion, and commit it to memory. He was no longer merely learning, he was rehearsing. Every night, after the last worker had left and the oil lamps flickered in dim corners, he crawled beneath the iron press for hours, testing tolerances, perfecting his timing, refining his understanding of the machine's lethal precision. He was creating a blueprint not just in thought, but in practice, a silent, meticulous plan for control. Prophet had begun to sense the magnitude of what was happening. The boy he watches, he waits. One day the machine will speak through him. He whispered to Bess in quiet tones, eyes darting toward the press as if it were a living thing. Thomas never revealed his intentions, never betrayed a flicker of anticipation. His expression remained blank, perfectly neutral, concealing the storm of calculation within. Every glance, every nod, every step appeared compliant to Stroud, but in reality, the boy was preparing for a singular moment of execution. And now, if you are following closely, take a moment to anchor yourself in this story. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice in the comments, whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." This ritual is more than words. It is recognition of the patience, calculation, and inevitability building within the shadows of Hateville. By the third week of September, Thomas had rehearsed every motion, every turn of the wheel, every inch of the press. Stroud remained unaware that his control, his authority, and ultimately his life were all within the grasp of the smallest figure in the room. The stage was set. The machinery was primed. And soon, the culmination of months of silent observation, calculation, and patience would descend with unstoppable force. The night of September 13th, 1851, fell heavy and silent over Hateville. The cotton facility hummed with its usual ceaseless rhythm, yet in that darkness, a different current ran beneath the noise. A tension invisible to all but one. Small Thomas moved among the shadows, crawling beneath and between the iron plates, testing weight, adjusting angles with the precision of a mind that had turned every calculation into certainty. Stroud remained confident, pacing through the rows of machinery, whip coiled at his belt, satisfied that his control was absolute. He had no idea that the boy he purchased for 8 cents was no longer merely surviving. He was orchestrating inevitability. The other workers had long since become accustomed to the child's silent presence. They saw him as harmless, even pitiable, yet the truth was far darker. Thomas had memorized every sound, every creak of the wheel, every subtle vibration of the press. He had internalized the precise amount of pressure required to compress cotton into dense bales, and he had imagined what would happen if that knowledge were turned inward, applied not to plant fiber, but to the man who had ruled over him with cruelty. Prophet, observing from a distance, had whispered warnings in vain. "The fire grows," he murmured to Bess. "He carries knowledge too sharp to be ignored." Thomas moved methodically, testing his reach, practicing the turns of the wheel, calculating the rotations necessary to achieve absolute compression. Each motion was a rehearsal, a silent invocation of inevitability. Stroud's routines had been mapped, his patterns catalogued, every lapse noted and internalized. The overseer's confidence was his undoing, and the boy's patience had transformed into a weapon. And now, for anyone following this story, it is time to acknowledge what you are witnessing. Subscribe and comment your location, your town, your state. Twice in the comments whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let it anchor you. Let it mark your presence as a witness to the turning point of fate itself. As the night deepened, Thomas prepared for the first deliberate act, testing limits in silence. He was no longer just a child crawling beneath machinery. He was a mind aligned with inevitability, every observation ready to be applied, every calculation precise. Stroud, consumed by his own authority, had no awareness that the culmination of months of patience, study, and observation was imminent. The press, the overseer, and the child, everything had been arranged in the shadows, awaiting the moment when knowledge would become action, and the world of power and subjugation would shatter with a single, unstoppable. The night of September 14th arrived with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as if the air itself had paused in anticipation. Small Thomas moved beneath the flickering glow of the lanterns, each step precise, each motion deliberate. Stroud, oblivious, had settled into his usual routine, checking the machines, recording notes, ensuring the night shift moved at the relentless pace he demanded. He believed he was in control. He believed the child he had bought for 8 cents could do nothing more than follow orders. He could not have been more wrong. Thomas approached the main press with a calm that belied his small stature. Months of observation, of silent calculation, of relentless rehearsal had culminated in this moment. Every gear, every chain, every lever had been memorized, every inch of the press, every nuance of its operation, mapped in his mind with deadly clarity. The overseer's routine had been catalogued, his patterns observed, and now exploited. The boy knew exactly when Stroud would turn his back, exactly how long the wheel required to compress fully, exactly how to manipulate the mechanism with enough force to achieve total destruction. With the subtlety of a shadow, Thomas positioned himself, crawling onto the small wooden stool that had been constructed weeks earlier, innocuous yet essential. Each turn of the wheel was calculated, precise, executed with patience that seemed impossible for someone of his age and size. The iron plate responded exactly as he had envisioned, descending incrementally, methodically, until it reached the critical point. Sweat coated his hands, yet they did not tremble. His mind was perfectly focused, a machine of thought and calculation, a master of inevitability. Prophet's warnings echoed silently in the past, carried on the memory of months of counsel. Knowledge is fire. Use it wisely. Thomas had taken the fire, tamed it, and directed it with a surgeon's precision. Stroud remained unaware, a predator blinded by his own arrogance. The machinery, the child, and the overseer were now locked in a fatal choreography, every motion rehearsed, every moment anticipated. For viewers following this story, take a moment, subscribe, comment your location, and twice in the comments whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let it anchor you in this place where patience, knowledge, and inevitability converge. Tonight, history bends, and the instruments of oppression become the instruments of reckoning. Small Thomas, dismissed and undervalued, prepares to deliver a lesson that no ledger, no law, no overseer could anticipate, a lesson written not with words, but with force, precision, and the cold inevitability of years of unseen preparation. The first turn of the wheel was almost imperceptible, a quiet motion in the vast, humming darkness of the cotton facility. Small Thomas's fingers gripped the handles with a control that seemed unnatural, almost preternatural. The press, a leviathan of iron and wood, groaned faintly as it began its slow descent, responding to the child's measured effort. Stroud, still pacing nearby, glanced toward the mechanism, unaware of the subtle shift in power. Every rotation brought the iron plate closer to its grim destination, every turn a silent testament to the months of observation, patience, and calculation that had brought this moment into being. Thomas paused between rotations, inhaling the thick, oil-scented air, checking the alignment of the plate, confirming the tolerances he had memorized. The wooden stool beneath him creaked, scuffing faintly against the floor, but no one noticed. The overseer's arrogance blinded him to the reality unfolding in the shadows. He continued his rounds, jotting notes, snapping the leather strap at a worker's foot, a casual demonstration of control. Each sound, each movement only reinforced Thomas's calculations, providing feedback, confirming patterns, perfecting timing. With each subsequent turn, the press responded exactly as expected. The metal groaned, the chains shifted. The mechanism compressed the space between iron plate and floor with an inevitability as precise as mathematics. Thomas's small frame, underestimated for so long, bore the weight of absolute control. Every muscle, every thought, was synchronized with the machinery. For a moment the room seemed suspended, time stretched thin, as if the air itself recognized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The final rotations began, 17 precise turns calculated over months of silent observation and rehearsal, and the press reached its full compression. The iron plate, guided by the unassuming fingers of a boy dismissed as worthless, achieved its fatal alignment. Stroud remained unaware of the inevitability he had courted, of the reckoning built with every act of cruelty, every measure of contempt, every moment of dismissed intelligence. The machinery, the overseer, and the child were poised on the knife edge of history, and in the darkness of that September night, the culmination of months of patient, Meticulous planning would soon erupt in irreversible consequence. The dawn broke over Hateville with a strange stillness, as though the world itself had paused to witness the aftermath. Workers arrived for the morning shift, rubbing sleep from their eyes, expecting the familiar chaos of the cotton facility. The ceaseless hum of machinery, the shouting of supervisors, the rhythmic clatter of bales being moved. Instead, they were met with a silence so absolute it seemed unnatural, oppressive, and wrong. Lanterns still burned, casting flickering shadows across the iron and wooden frames, but the usual symphony of grinding gears and cotton-laden hands was absent. At the center of the main press, the horrifying truth revealed itself. Tobias Stroud lay beneath the massive iron plate, the culmination of Thomas's months of patient observation and calculation made manifest in the most precise and brutal way imaginable. His head, once a symbol of authority and fear, was gone, crushed beneath 17 calculated rotations of the press. The body remained intact, almost serene in its stillness, as though nature itself recoiled from the violence imposed with such deliberate intent. The witnesses would later describe the scene as unnatural. Stroud's form complete below the neck, yet above it only the evidence of obliteration. The iron plate rested with the weight of inevitability, a testament to what patience, knowledge, and underestimated intelligence could achieve. Small Thomas stood nearby, silent, barely visible, his expression as unreadable as it had been when first purchased for 8 cents. No triumph crossed his face, no exultation, only the cold clarity of a plan brought to completion. The workers recoiled, whispers of disbelief filling the space, their eyes darting from the child to the destroyed overseer, struggling to comprehend the impossible. Prophet, standing in a shadowed corner, muttered under his breath, "The fire, it burns brighter than I imagined." And now, for those following closely, anchor yourself. Subscribe and comment your location. Twice in the comments, whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let the weight of this moment settle within you. The lessons here are not merely about cruelty or vengeance. They are about the hidden potential of patience, observation, and the underestimation of those society deems weak. Thomas had transformed invisibility into control, helplessness into power. The machinery that had been a tool of oppression became the instrument of reckoning. The boy who was bought for a fraction of a dollar had turned the world upside down in a single, precise act. And yet, even in this moment of horror, the story was only beginning. The echoes of this night would ripple through Hateville, shaping fear, suspicion, and the understanding that the smallest hand could wield the greatest force. By mid-morning, Hateville was a town gripped by horror and confusion. News of Tobias Stroud's death traveled faster than any cotton shipment, carried by whispers, by the rattling wheels of wagons, by the stunned faces of those who dared approach the facility. The overseer's body beneath the press defied understanding. No one could explain how such a small child, purchased for 8 cents and assumed incapable of anything beyond minor tasks, had managed to operate the massive iron press with deadly precision. Murmurs of fear threaded through the workers, mingling with awe, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing dread. Sheriff Edmund Howell arrived within the hour, his veteran eyes scanning the scene with practiced caution. A man of 60, hardened by frontier justice and rural violence, he had seen cruelty in its many forms, yet even he found himself unsettled. He noted the position of the press, the indentations in the wooden step stool, the exact count of 17 rotations marked on the screw mechanism, and the perfect placement of the body. Howell's report, later filed with the county clerk, described the scene as precise, deliberate, almost surgical in its execution. He questioned the workers, but their fear was palpable, their recollections fragmented by the shock of what had transpired. No one dared speak openly about the boy. Meanwhile, small Thomas remained silent, invisible among the chaos. He had not fled, nor shown panic, nor offered explanation. He had become a ghost, a force so contained and disciplined that even now, no adult dared fully confront him. Prophet Bess and the few who had quietly watched over him understood something that the sheriff and the townspeople could not articulate. The boy's act was not born of whim, not born of sudden rage, but of calculation, patience, and the transformation of perceived weakness into inevitability. By the afternoon, a murmur of unease spread through Hateville's elite. The families of the plantation owners, the investors in Cyrus Gantry's cotton enterprise, began to question how such a failure of control could occur. Rumors circulated, yet documentation would later show deliberate obfuscation. Records vanished, reports were altered, and Thomas himself became an enigma, a footnote in official accounts, a ghost whose existence and deed were erased from the ledger. But for those who had witnessed, the truth could never be fully buried. The days following Stroud's death were marked by an uneasy hush that settled over Hateville like a thick fog. Work continued at the cotton facility, but the rhythm had changed. The machines seemed to move with a newfound awareness, the air heavy with the memory of what had occurred. Enslaved workers glanced at one another nervously, speaking in muted tones, careful to avoid mention of the boy whose hands had wrought impossible violence. Prophet, the elder who had quietly guided Thomas in the past months, muttered repeatedly, "He has learned the language of the press, and it speaks only truth." Authorities came and went, their investigations perfunctory. Sheriff Howell recorded his observations with precision, yet his questions seemed to ripple off the walls and dissolve into the cotton dust. Nothing made sense. A child had executed the act with a mastery no adult could comprehend, and yet no force of law could explain it. Cyrus Gantry, the owner of the facility, feared the implications, not just the death of his overseer, but the exposure of vulnerability within his empire of cotton and commerce. The story, if told openly, would undermine the authority upon which the entire town rested, and so a deliberate cover-up began. Records were altered, mentions of the boy erased, the event sanitized in official reports. Thomas became invisible in the eyes of history, yet present in every whispered fear that lingered in the shadows. Small Thomas himself returned to his routines as though nothing had changed. He moved with the same silent precision, crawling beneath presses, fetching tools, tending to machinery, and observing the adults around him. No one dared approach him directly. They knew, instinctively, that the boy who had crushed a man's skull beneath iron was not to be tested. Stroud's absence was a ghost at every station, a constant reminder of what patience, observation, and meticulous preparation could accomplish. The facility itself seemed to acknowledge his presence, each machine becoming an extension of his awareness, every gear and lever an instrument of quiet command. And now, for those who follow this dark narrative, take your ritual. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice in the comments whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let this acknowledgement bind you to the story, letting the understanding of hidden power, overlooked potential, and unrecognized calculation settle within you. Thomas had become more than a worker. He was a force, a shadow of inevitability in the very heart of Hateville. The overseer's death had not liberated the oppressed in the traditional sense, but it had rewritten the rules of control, subtly, invisibly, irrevocably. And though the adults tried to resume their lives, the memory of what one underestimated boy had accomplished lingered, infecting the minds of all who knew, a quiet warning that power often resides where it is least expected. Weeks passed, yet the tension within Hateville never fully dissipated. The cotton facility resumed its routines, but every worker, every overseer, every plantation agent who passed through carried the invisible weight of what had transpired. Thomas moved among the machines with silent purpose, a boy no longer merely purchased for 8 cents, but a presence that the adults dared not question. His small frame belied the knowledge and control he wielded, an understanding so deep that it seemed almost unnatural. Every turn of a wheel, every adjustment to a chain, every careful manipulation of iron plates was executed with the precision of one who had memorized not just mechanics but inevitability itself. Cyrus Gantry, meanwhile, wrestled with anxiety he could not articulate. Stroud's death had revealed weaknesses within the system he thought unassailable. The elite of Hateville whispered behind closed doors, discussing ways to mitigate the risk of such insubordination, such unpredictable agency emerging from the smallest of hands. But the reality was terrifyingly simple. The facility had been penetrated, its routines observed, and its authority undermined by a single underestimated child. The memory of that night lingered in every shadow, in every corner of the press room, in every creak of the machines. The enslaved workers, too, navigated a new landscape of fear and awe. They no longer saw Thomas solely as a boy to be pitied or assisted. He had become an enigma, a figure whose capability surpassed what anyone could have imagined. Prophet continued his quiet vigilance, whispering warnings and observations to those who could understand, teaching that knowledge, patience, and patience again could overturn even the most rigid hierarchies. The psychological ripple was profound. The very structure of obedience had been shown to be fragile, manipulable, and vulnerable to subtle but relentless intelligence. Thomas continued his silent reign over the machinery. While outwardly he performed routine tasks, inwardly he observed, memorized, and strategized, understanding the rhythms of both men and metal. Stroud's death was not just vengeance, it was mastery, a demonstration of patience and calculated action. Hateville would remember only fragments of what had occurred, official reports sanitized and manipulated, but for those who witnessed, even briefly, the truth of what a single underestimated child could accomplish, the lesson would remain eternal, etched in shadows, whispered in fear, and understood in silent awe. As the weeks turned into months, Hateville seemed to oscillate between routine and unease. Life pressed forward, but every adult carried the invisible memory of what had occurred under the press. Thomas moved through the cotton facility with the same quiet mastery, his small form weaving between gears and iron plates like a ghost, unseen but omnipresent. He no longer needed guidance. Every mechanism, every lever, every screw that could threaten or serve him had been catalogued in his mind. He had become the silent architect of the facility, shaping outcomes without ever raising a hand in aggression, except when necessary, and history would only ever note the one occasion. Workers whispered among themselves carefully, their words laced with fear and awe. The child who had crushed a man's skull now navigated the workplace as though nothing had happened, and yet his presence reminded them of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Power is not always measured by size or wealth. Stroud's absence loomed as an unspoken lesson in vigilance and humility. Prophet often murmured, eyes cast toward Thomas. The smallest flame can burn the strongest wood. Even Bess, who had offered kindness and protection, kept her distance, understanding that the boy's understanding of consequence far exceeded what anyone dared assume. Cyrus Gintry found himself increasingly unsettled, aware that his empire, built on the labor of the enslaved and the efficiency of overseers, had been breached in a way that could never be corrected by authority alone. Reports were sanitized, questions deflected, and records altered. Stroud's death was recorded as a tragic accident, a machine malfunction. Yet everyone who had seen the aftermath understood the truth, and in that understanding lay a subtle terror. Every action in the facility now carried a shadow of Thomas's presence, every rotation of a wheel and shift of a lever echoing the night when control had been redefined. And now, as you follow this story, anchor yourself in its lesson. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice in the comments whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let the repetition bind the truth within you, the understanding that intelligence, patience, and calculation can overturn expectations, no matter how improbable. Thomas's quiet dominion extended beyond mechanics. He observed the rhythms of human behavior, the subtle patterns of fear, ambition, and arrogance. He learned when a glance could intimidate, when silence could unsettle, and how even the mightiest authority could be manipulated without a word. Hateville continued its routines, but underneath, the knowledge of what one small, underestimated hand had wrought lingered like a spectre, a lesson whispered through the cotton dust, unseen yet undeniable, and permanently altering the psychological landscape of the town. As the harvest season waned, an almost imperceptible paranoia gripped Hateville. The town's elite, those whose wealth and reputation had long insulated them from consequence, now walked cautiously, their confidence eroded by the knowledge that control could be overturned in the smallest of ways. Cyrus Gintry avoided prolonged inspection of the presses, delegating oversight to men whose fear was palpable. The adults spoke less, their conversations muted and guarded, wary of the invisible presence they could not name. The death of Tobias Stroud had planted a seed, a recognition that authority was fragile, that mastery of knowledge could surpass mastery of power, and that the underestimated could overturn entire hierarchies. Small Thomas, silent and precise, continued his work unnoticed, yet nothing he did went unobserved. His eyes, dark and calculating, tracked each subtle pattern. The hesitation of a worker, the twitch of a foreman's hand, the shift in gantry's expression. He had become more than a boy who survived. He was a living record of observation, a quiet manipulator of consequence. Machines were no longer just tools, they were extensions of his will, and every adult, every overseer, and every supervisor now operated under an invisible rhythm dictated by the smallest, most underestimated figure in the facility. Prophet, ever the quiet guardian, recognized a truth others could not. Thomas had transcended the limitations placed upon him by physical stature, societal perception, and even the brutality of his purchase price. 8 cents had purchased not just a child, but a mind capable of meticulous patience, precise calculation, and ultimate control. The elder whispered this quietly to those who could hear. The boy bends what others think unbreakable. Watch the smallest hands, they move mountains in silence. Bess, watching from the kitchen doorway, silently nodded, knowing that kindness alone had never shaped this outcome. Observation and patience had, and now for those listening, bind this knowledge within you. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice in the comments whisper, I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth. Let the lesson embed itself. The underestimated can wield unimaginable power when patience, calculation, and invisibility align. The months that followed etched fear and respect into the very walls of the cotton facility. Gossip among the townspeople grew, stories of a child who moved unseen, who understood machinery better than the adults, who held the power to enforce consequences without ever raising a hand. Stroud's death was sanitized in official records, but the truth lingered in shadows, shaping behavior, dictating caution, and reminding everyone that history often conceals the extraordinary acts of those deemed insignificant. Small Thomas had become more than a boy. He was a specter, a master of silent influence, and the embodiment of a terrifying lesson. Knowledge and patience could topple even the most entrenched power. Years passed, yet the shadow of that September morning never faded from Hateville. Thomas, once the boy purchased for 8 cents, grew quietly, almost invisibly, into adolescence. His stature remained small, his appearance unassuming, yet every movement he made carried the same precise, deliberate energy that had once turned the cotton press into an instrument of fatal authority. The adults who remembered Stroud's death treated him with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. They knew that beneath his quiet exterior lay a mind that had already rewritten the rules of power within the facility, and perhaps within the town itself. The whispers in town grew into stories, half-remembered truths stitched together with rumor and imagination. Parents warned their children, "The boy under the presses sees more than you think." Travelers passing through would hear fragments, tales of a child whose patience and cunning had undone one of the most feared overseers in Georgia. The story took on a mythic quality, becoming both cautionary tale and dark legend. Even those who did not witness the events firsthand felt the invisible influence Thomas exerted. The community's social hierarchy had subtly shifted, fear now interlaced with every interaction, a lingering echo of the event that no official record could ever fully erase. Thomas himself remained silent, meticulous, and observant. He did not flaunt his intelligence or wield it with arrogance. He simply existed within the margins, gathering knowledge, calculating, and shaping outcomes without detection. Machines continued to obey him as much as he obeyed their patterns. Adults, workers, and even gantry learned to anticipate his movements, to leave space for the small figure whose presence was now inseparable from the rhythms of the facility. The boy who had once been purchased for a pittance had become the axis upon which the machinery, the workforce, and the psychological landscape of Hateville turned. By the end of 1852, the town had learned to respect Thomas without acknowledgement, to fear him without confronting him, and to understand that history often preserves the mundane while erasing the extraordinary. Stroud's demise became a silent benchmark, a lesson in precision, patience, and the terrifying potency of underestimated knowledge. Thomas's legacy, though unrecorded officially, lived on in the whispers, in the shadows, and in the invisible structures of control that he had quietly rewritten. By the close of 1852, Hateville was a town forever altered, though few could articulate how. Small Thomas, the boy bought for 8 cents, had become an invisible sovereign within the cotton facility, a silent observer whose knowledge and patience had redefined power itself. Adults moved cautiously around him, anticipating his awareness, altering behavior subtly, unconsciously, as if they were characters in a story whose author they could neither see nor influence. Stroud's death had been the first visible fracture, the proof that one underestimated individual could bend circumstance with meticulous precision. Now, that proof had been internalized by all who remained. The cotton press, once a symbol of productivity and control, had transformed into a monument of latent authority, its mechanisms aligned with the boy's understanding, its levers and gears extensions of his silent will. Thomas operated in the shadows, never claiming dominance but always exerting it, a presence so quiet that adults often forgot he was there, only to be reminded in subtle, unspoken ways that control had shifted. His very existence challenged assumptions, demonstrating that intellect, patience, and courage could outweigh size, wealth, and social standing. The legacy he left behind was one of psychological inevitability. Those who underestimated him had been marked by fear, caution, and respect, whether consciously recognized or not. The town itself seemed to pulse with the memory of that impossible act, the crushing of a man's skull by a child, deliberate, precise, and unstoppable. Conversations avoided the topic, yet its weight lingered in every corner, in every shadow of the facility, in every hesitant glance between adults who remembered. The narrative of history had been sanitized. Stroud's demise became a footnote, an accident, recorded in official records. But for those who had seen, heard, or simply sensed the transformation, the truth endured. Unspoken yet undeniable, Thomas had rewritten the rules of power, reshaping authority and fear in ways that would echo for generations. And now, for those who have followed this story to its end, take the final step. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice in the comments whisper, "I see what others ignore. I see the hidden truth." Let the lesson settle fully within you. Understand that history is not always written in ink. Often it is engraved in shadows, in quiet acts of brilliance and calculated courage, in the invisible minds of those the world dismisses. Small Thomas faded from the historical record, yet his influence remained, a haunting whisper in the machinery, in the cotton dust, in the very psychology of Hateville. The boy purchased for 8 cents had become immortal, not through recognition, not through reward, but through a single, irrevocable act that revealed a timeless truth the underestimated can alter the course of the world, quietly, invisibly, and forever.